Hey y'all, so today I'm going to be doing an original tag that I have decided to call the BookTube Hype tag. Basically, this tag consists of 5 questions that deal with book hype on BookTube, and for each question, the goal is to list 5 books, or more or less if you so desire, that fit whatever category the question is asking for. And then for each book to give a 1 or 2 sentence reason why you chose that book for that question. And for me personally, I want to note that when I talk about these books because of BookTube hype, I'm mostly focusing on books that have a lot of hype on BookTube, like books that most people who watch BookTube will be familiar with. Because I personally find most of my books through BookTube. There are obviously several exceptions, but most of the books that I read and discover are through BookTube, so I wanted to focus just on the ones that get a ton of hype on BookTube. So without further ado, let's just jump into the questions. So question number 1 is to list 5 books that you believe really live up to the hype that they get on BookTube. So my first book, and the first one that I thought of for this, was Ready Player One by Ernest Cline. I read this in 2014, and at the time it was getting insane amounts of hype, and I read it and absolutely loved it, and I definitely think that it deserves the hype that it gets on BookTube. My second book, or series in this case, is The Infernal Devices by Cassandra Clare. I love the Mortal Instrument series, and I read that before this, so when I heard all over BookTube that this trilogy was better than the Mortal Instruments, I was very skeptical, but BookTube was very right. This trilogy is amazing, and it definitely deserves the hype that it gets on BookTube. The third series for this is the Lunar Chronicles series by Marissa Meyer. I read this last year and I'd heard so much about it, so I had pretty high expectations going into it, and I wasn't disappointed. This is a really fun, fast-paced, and really interesting sci-fi series that are retellings of fairy tales. The fourth book in this category is The Name of the Wind by Patrick Rothfuss. This is probably the one that has the least hype out of the ones in the section, but I did see it pretty much all over BookTube before I read it. And even though I haven't continued on to the second book in the Kingkiller Chronicle, I absolutely loved this first book, and I think once the third book comes out, I will reread it and then continue on and finish the trilogy. Seriously, everything about this book is really fantastic. And then the fifth and final book for this question is the best book that I've read because of BookTube, and that is The Final Empire by Brandon Sanderson, which is the first book in the Mistborn trilogy. Brandon Sanderson's books have gotten a ton of hype on BookTube, but especially the Mistborn trilogy, and so I eventually picked it up last summer and fell completely in love, and this is definitely my favorite book in the trilogy. And like with The Name of the Wind, everything about this trilogy is perfection. So now moving on to question number 2, which is kind of the flip side of the previous question, which is to list 5 books that you think did not live up to the hype that they receive on BookTube. So any books that you have read that have received a ton of hype and praise on BookTube that you just really didn't enjoy or you didn't think lived up to the hype that they received. The first one for me is definitely Looking for Alaska by John Green. John Green books in general are very popular on BookTube and among teenagers and young adults, but I just really didn't like Looking for Alaska. I believe it is the only book on my Goodreads that I have given 1 star to. I just didn't think that the story was very unique. I didn't think that the twists were very cleverly done. I thought they were kind of obvious, and I despised the characters. The second book that I thought didn't live up to the hype on BookTube is the Shatter Me trilogy by Tahereh Mafi, specifically the first book, Shatter Me. This book gets praised for its beautiful writing, but I thought it was just way too flowery and too metaphorical and just too overly complicated, and I thought the plot suffered because of it, and I didn't find any of the characters to be particularly likable. Like, honestly, forget the love triangle and just get with Kenji, because he's the only likable character in the series for me. The third book that I think didn't live up to the hype that it gets on BookTube is We Were Liars by E. Lockhart. Overall, this book was fine, but I didn't really think that there was anything special or particularly interesting about it, and I think that it tried to surprise the reader, but I found it to be very predictable, and I figured out what was going on very early on. My fourth book for this question is Me and Earl and the Dying Girl by Jessie Andrews. I thought the plot was pretty flimsy, and even though I thought the narrator's voice was pretty funny and that some of the storytelling techniques used within the book were really interesting, overall I was just pretty disappointed with this book. And then finally, the last book that I have for this section is the Divergent trilogy by Veronica Roth, particularly Allegiant. Overall, I think on BookTube that the opinion on this last book in the trilogy is pretty negative, or at least very mixed. However, I also didn't really like Insurgent that much. I thought it was alright, but the only book that I actually enjoyed in the trilogy was Divergent, and at this point it's been a couple years, so I don't even know if I reread it now if I would still enjoy it. So now moving on to question number 3, which is to list 5 books that you really want to read because of the major hype that they've been getting on BookTube. And the first and most obvious pick for this question for me was the Throne of Glass series by Sarah J. Maas. I have been meaning to read this series ever since I first started watching BookTube more than 2 years ago, and I still haven't done it. So hopefully I will be getting to this soon, but the hype on BookTube is definitely what has caused me to want to read this. The second one for this question is the Falling Kingdom series by Morgan Rhodes. This book has just been picking up steam on BookTube over the past year. I feel like I see it everywhere, so I definitely want to pick this up, and I do think that I included this in the 16 books that I need to read in 2016, alongside Throne of Glass, so I definitely hope to get to that very soon. Another book that I really want to read because I feel like I've seen it everywhere since its release is Six of Crows by Leigh Bardugo. Like I said, I feel like I have seen this book on literally every BookTube channel over the past few months, and it's really intriguing to me because it deals with a heist, like with the Final Empire and the Mistborn trilogy, so I am definitely really excited to pick this up soon. Book number 4 for this question is The Way of Kings by Brandon Sanderson. Brandon Sanderson consistently gets a lot of hype on BookTube, and I feel like this is one of his most praised books. I don't think I've ever seen a negative review of this book, and it's currently in my book stack, so I will probably be picking it up within the next few months. And finally, the 5th book for this section is The Iron Trial by Cassandra Clare and Holly Black. This is one that I've been wanting to read for a while now, and it has several elements that I really, really love in books, so again, I hope to pick this one up in the near future. So now moving on to question number 4, which once again is kind of the flip side of the previous question, which is what are 5 books that are very hyped on BookTube that you don't really have any interest in reading. The first one, kind of to tie in with one of the books that I didn't like that was really hyped on BookTube, is just John Green's books in general. While I did enjoy The Fault in Our Stars, I have heard that a lot of his books are pretty similar in the characters and they have pretty basic plots, so I just don't really have any interest in picking up any more of his books. The second book for this section is Red Queen by Victoria Aveyard. On the surface, this sounds like it's exactly up my alley, and when I first heard about it last year, I was really intrigued, and I think I even had it on a top of my TBR video. But over the past year since it's been released, I've just heard that it combines many pretty basic dystopia tropes and doesn't really do anything new or fresh with them, so I've pretty much lost interest in it and I don't think I'll ever pick it up. The third book on this list is the Fifth Wave series by Rick Yancey. When I first started watching BookTube, the Fifth Wave was majorly hyped, and I feel like it's died down a little bit since the release of the second book, which a lot of people thought was pretty mediocre, but honestly, I never really had much interest in it in the first place because I don't really like alien books. Like, it's not something that I actively dislike, but it's never something that I've really wanted to pick up. The fourth book in this section is the Legend trilogy by Marie Lu. I guess kind of on the surface this sounds like something I might enjoy, but whenever I hear about it, the premise just doesn't interest me. I don't know why. I've just never really been interested in picking up this trilogy. And finally, the fifth book for this question is the Grisha trilogy by Leigh Bardugo. Even though I'm really interested in picking up Six of Crows, I am not, have never been, and probably never will be interested in picking up the Grisha trilogy. And it's kind of like the Legend trilogy in the fact that I guess on paper it sounds like something I might be interested in, but anytime I hear the premise, it just doesn't interest me. I don't have any rhyme or reason for it, but I just have never even thought about picking up this trilogy, and it has never really interested me. So now moving on to the fifth and final question in this tag, which is to list 5 books that you think deserve more hype on BookTube. These could be books that are talked about some on BookTube, but you think deserve more hype, or maybe books that have gotten fairly average reviews on BookTube but you really loved, or maybe just books that you never see talked about on BookTube that you really think deserve hype. And of course, the first book that I'm going to talk about for this question is the series that I think is possibly the most underrated thing ever on BookTube, and that is the Pendragon series by DJ McHale. I know of maybe a handful of booktubers who have ever even mentioned this book and series on BookTube, let alone people who have actually read the series. This is a really fun series with lots of really interesting characters and really well-developed worlds, and it's just one big, long, amazing adventure, and I absolutely love it and think that it deserves so much more hype on BookTube. The second book for this question is actually just an author in general, and that is Beth Revis. If we're going to be specific here, I'm going to go with her book The Body Electric, because I have heard almost no one talk about this, but her trilogy, the Across the Universe trilogy, is also not talked about a ton on BookTube. I think Beth Revis, just in general, is an amazing sci-fi writer. Her books are so well written and her worlds are so well developed, and I love her books so much. She's one of my favorite authors and she deserves so much more praise on BookTube. My third book for this question is The Bone Season by Samantha Shannon. It's definitely talked about some and read some on BookTube, but I feel like the opinions given about it have been pretty mixed, and I really love this book so much. Its sequel is also amazing. I love everything about the series, and I just wish that more people on BookTube would read it and talk about it and hopefully enjoy it. Book number 4 for this section is Witches Volume 1 by Scott Snyder. While I absolutely love the Saga comic series, this is my personal favorite single edition of a comic series that I've read. The plot is really intriguing, the artwork is beautiful, and overall I just thought that it was a really amazing first volume to a comic series, and I haven't heard a ton of people talk about it. I think Jesse the Reader talked about it, and that might be the only booktuber that I've seen who has read it. And finally, the fifth and final book for this question is The Chimes by Anna Smale. This was longlisted for the Man Booker in 2015, and it has been discussed briefly by Ariel Bissett, and Max from Well Done Books read it and really enjoyed it. But other than that, it hasn't really popped up very many places on BookTube, and it has very few ratings on Goodreads as well, and I absolutely love this book. I completely understand that this book is not necessarily for everyone, and it is very heavy on the literary fiction at the beginning of the novel, but it's such a cool story and the prose is so beautiful, and I love all of the musical analogies that are used within it. It's just, I completely loved this book, and I would just want so many people to read this. I want everyone to read this book and love it as much as I did. So that is it for the BookTube hype tag. As this is a tag and it is an original tag, I'm going to be tagging a few people. So the 3 people I'm going to be tagging are Elizabeth Page, Lindsay Ray, and G Swizzle Books. And of course, I also tag you. If you are watching this video and you want to do this tag, please do it. Send me a link, put it down below in the comments. I would love to see your videos doing this tag. As always, I will leave links down in the description to my blog, Twitter, and Goodreads. Please add me as a friend on Goodreads. I would love to be friends with all of you. Like, comment, subscribe, all that jazz. Thank you so much for watching. Bye!